Let my mother go and I'll put you on your feet." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Sharp, impossible, dangerous. 12-year-old Kevin Washington stood in the center aisle, his small frame barely visible behind the rows of wooden benches. His voice steady, clear, unnervingly calm, didn't match his age. It carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, understood too much, survived too much. Judge William Carter stopped mid-motion, his fingers frozen on the edge of a legal document. For 8 years, he'd been bound to that wheelchair. 8 years, since the accident on Interstate 95 that crushed his spine and left him paralyzed from the waist down. 8 years of physical therapy, experimental treatments, prayers that went unanswered, and a bitterness that had calcified into cruelty. And now this child, this black child from the projects, was standing in his courtroom, making promises that defied medicine, science, and reality itself. The laughter started small. A snicker from one of the prosecutors, a chuckle from a court reporter. Then it spread like wildfire through the gallery. Lawyers in expensive suits doubled over. Spectators wiped tears from their eyes. Even the bailiffs, men trained to maintain order, couldn't suppress their grins. "That kid has lost his mind," a woman in the third row whispered to her companion, loud enough for Kevin to hear. She wore pearls and a navy blazer, the kind of outfit that screamed old money and older prejudices. Poor thing. Poverty does terrible things to children. Makes them unstable. Her friend nodded sympathetically, clutching her designer handbag a little tighter, as if Kevin's desperation might be contagious. Kevin didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, much worse. He stood there, hands at his sides, his dark eyes moving methodically across the room. He wasn't looking at the crowd the way a frightened child would, searching for sympathy or support. No, he was studying them, cataloging, recording every face, every reaction, every person who laughed at him in this moment would be remembered, because Kevin Washington had learned something in his 12 years that most people never learn in a lifetime. People reveal their true selves when they think you're powerless. His mother, Deborah Washington, sat in the defendant's chair 20 feet away. Her wrists were cuffed, an unnecessary humiliation for a woman accused of a non-violent crime. She was 42 but looked older. Years of working 3 jobs had carved lines into her face that makeup couldn't hide. Her hair, usually neat and pulled back, had started to come loose from its bun. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she kept mouthing the same words over and over. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Deborah had worked as a janitor in this courthouse for 15 years. She knew every corner of this building, every judge, every prosecutor, every lawyer who walked these halls. She'd cleaned their offices, emptied their trash, scrubbed their toilets. She'd been invisible to them, a ghost who made their world function while remaining beneath their notice, until someone needed a scapegoat. $50,000 had vanished from the administrative safe. Just vanished, as if it had grown legs and walked out. And when you need someone to blame for a crime, who better than the poor black cleaning lady who had access to the building after hours? The evidence was circumstantial at best. Deborah had the combination to the safe, that much was true. She worked late, shifts when the building was mostly empty. She needed money. That was enough for them. It had always been enough. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel, because what Kevin was about to do in that courtroom would shake the foundations of an entire justice system. Judge Carter finally found his voice. It came out hard and sharp, like gravel scraping against metal. "Boy," he said, leaning forward in his wheelchair. "This is a serious court, not a circus. Your mother is guilty and will be convicted. There are no miracles here. Do you understand me?" The courtroom erupted again, laughter mixing with scattered applause. Someone in the back, a man in an expensive suit, whistled like he was at a sporting event. Kevin's expression didn't change. He'd expected this, all of it. "I know who stole the money," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the room like he was speaking through a microphone. "And I know how to prove it." The laughter paused, just for a moment, just long enough for confusion to ripple through the crowd. Then it came back louder than before. "Then speak up. Sherlock Holmes from the projects. someone shouted from the gallery, and the room howled with fresh amusement. Kevin smiled. It was small, controlled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "First," he said, "you release my mother. Then I'll show you how you'll walk again." The courtroom fell into a strange, suspended silence. Not because anyone believed him, but because there was something unsettling about this child. Something that didn't quite fit. Most 12-year-olds would be crying by now, begging, making emotional pleas for mercy. Kevin Washington stood like a soldier, awaiting orders, while the adults laughed and mocked and dismissed. Not one of them noticed the small digital recorder partially visible in the front pocket of Kevin's backpack. Not one of them noticed how his eyes kept drifting to a specific person in the room, Thomas Mitchell, the judge's administrative assistant, who sat at a side table with a stack of legal folders in front of him. Mitchell was a thin man in his late 40s with thinning brown hair and a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses every few seconds. Right now, those adjustments were happening faster than usual. His face had gone pale. His hands, which had been casually flipping through documents moments ago, had stopped moving entirely, because when Kevin said he knew who stole the money, Thomas Mitchell had stopped laughing, and Kevin noticed. Judge Carter slammed his gavel down with enough force to crack the sound block. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. "Silence," he roared. "I will have order in this courtroom." The laughter died down, but smirks remained on dozens of faces. Carter pointed a gnarled finger at Kevin. His face was flushed red, and a vein throbbed visibly in his temple. "Enough of this nonsense. Bailiff, remove this child from my courtroom before I charge him with contempt." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Gordon who'd worked courthouse security for 20 years, started moving toward Kevin. But Kevin didn't budge. 6 months, Kevin said. Gordon paused. 6 months, Kevin repeated, louder this time. "That's how long I spent investigating every single person in this courtroom." Thomas Mitchell's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. The sound was small, but in the sudden quiet, it might as well have been a bomb going off. Kevin's eyes locked onto Mitchell. 6 months watching, listening, taking notes. "You think kids are invisible, right? That we don't understand adult conversations? That we're too young, too stupid, too irrelevant to pay attention to?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "That was your first mistake." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound drew every eye in the room. A woman strode down the center aisle with the confidence of someone who had walked into 1,000 hostile rooms and conquered every single one. She was in her mid-40s, black, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Deborah made in 3 months. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and had the kind of presence that made people instinctively sit up straighter. "The boy is right." Her voice was clear, authoritative, and it silenced the courtroom more effectively than any gavel could. Judge Carter's face went from red to purple. "Who the hell are you?" The woman reached the front of the courtroom and pulled a business card from her jacket pocket, holding it up like a badge. "Attorney Patricia Williams, New York Bar Association. I'm here to represent the Washington family." The name hit the room like a physical force. Patricia Williams wasn't just any lawyer. She was a legend. Civil rights cases were her specialty, and she had a reputation for dismantling corrupt systems with the precision of a surgeon. Her win rate was 97%. She'd taken on police departments, district attorneys, judges, entire municipalities, and she almost never lost. Prosecutor Richard Davidson, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a permanent expression of smug superiority, stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant already has representation." "Had representation," Patricia corrected smoothly. She gestured to the court-appointed defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Gerald Moss who'd been assigned to Deborah's case 3 days ago and had barely reviewed the file. "Mr. Moss has graciously agreed to step aside. Haven't you, Mr. Moss?" Moss looked like he'd just been granted a pardon from execution. "Yes, absolutely. The family deserves experienced counsel." He gathered his papers and practically fled to the gallery. Davidson sputtered. "This is Judge. We need time to..." "Time to what?" Patricia cut him off. "Her done." The voice was sharp enough to draw blood. Time to railroad an innocent woman without proper representation. Time to convict her based on racism and circumstantial evidence. The word racism fell into the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Carter's jaw clenched. Counselor, you will watch your tone in my courtroom. Patricia smiled. It wasn't warm. Of course, Your Honor. As long as you watch yours outside of it. The implication was clear. Patricia had done her homework. She knew about Carter, about Davidson, about the culture of this courthouse. Kevin watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was exactly what he'd hoped for when he'd called her 3 weeks ago. It had taken him 2 weeks just to find her number. He'd used the computers at the public library, searching through legal databases and news articles until he found her name attached to a case in New York, where she'd exposed a police department for systematically targeting Black and Latino residents. The article included her law firm's contact information. He'd called from a payphone outside a convenience store, using quarters he'd saved from helping elderly neighbors carry groceries. When the receptionist answered, Kevin had asked to speak with Miss Williams directly. I'm sorry, but Miss Williams is very busy. Can I take a message? Tell her, Kevin had said carefully, that I'm a 12-year-old black kid whose mother is being framed for a crime she didn't commit. Tell her, I know who really did it. And tell her that if she doesn't take this case, an innocent woman is going to prison, while a racist judge and a corrupt thief walk free. There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Hold, please. 2 minutes later, Patricia Williams herself picked up. This is Patricia. Tell me everything. Kevin had talked for 45 minutes, using every quarter he had. He told her about his mother, about the missing money, about the rushed investigation and the predetermined verdict. He told her about Judge Carter's reputation, about the racist comments he'd overheard, about Thomas Mitchell's suspicious new car and expensive watch. When he finished, Patricia had been quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'll be there. And Kevin, don't tell anyone I'm coming. Let them think you're alone. People get careless when they think they've already won. Now, standing in the courtroom, Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, I'm formally requesting that this case be reopened for new evidence. I have substantial documentation pointing to the real culprit in this theft. Carter's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Denied. This case has already been decided. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Washington had access, opportunity, and motive. Actually, Patricia interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a knife through butter. Federal law allows me to present new evidence if there is reasonable suspicion of judicial error based on racial prejudice. She pulled out another document, this one with an official seal at the top, and held it up for the courtroom to see. This is an order from the federal prosecutor's office authorizing a full Brinks investigation into this case in this courtroom. It was issued this morning. Davidson looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. The federal prosecutor's office? That's correct. When a case involves potential civil rights violations and a pattern of racial bias, it becomes a federal matter. Patricia's eyes swept across the room, landing on each person who'd laughed at Kevin earlier. And I have reason to believe this case is exactly that. Thomas Mitchell tried to stand up quietly, as if he could somehow slip out of the room without being noticed. But Kevin's voice stopped. Tim Cold. Mr. Mitchell. Kevin's tone was polite, almost friendly. Don't you want to stay and listen? After all, you work so closely with Judge Carter. You must be curious about who really stole that money. Mitchell froze halfway out of his chair. His face had gone from pale to gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Patricia smiled like a shark that had just spotted blood in the water. Funny you should mention Mr. Mitchell, Kevin. She pulled out yet another document. Mr. Mitchell, could you explain to the court how you managed to purchase a $300,000 house last month? According to our records, your annual salary is $45,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Thomas Mitchell, who looked like he was about to vomit. That's a private matter, he stammered. Not when it's relevant to a criminal investigation, Patricia countered. The house was purchased with cash. $45,000 a year. But you paid $300,000 in cash. Where did that money come from, Mr. Mitchell? Mitchell's mouth opened and closed, like a fish drowning in air. I saved. You saved? Patricia's voice dripped with skepticism. Let's do some math. Your salary, after taxes, is approximately $32,000 annually, assuming you spent nothing, no rent, no food, no utilities, no clothing. It would take you nearly 10 years to save that amount. Yet you've only worked here for 4 years. The courtroom was dead silent now. No one was laughing anymore. Kevin spoke up again, his young voice somehow carrying more authority than most of the adults in the room. There's also the BMW you drive, the Rolex you wear, the country club membership. Should I keep going? Mitchell's legs gave out, and he collapsed back into his chair. Judge Carter looked like he was watching his entire world crumble in real time. His face had gone from purple to white, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. This is absurd, he managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. Patricia pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the previous ones. Your Honor, over the past 3 weeks, Kevin Washington and I have conducted a thorough investigation. We have documented evidence of financial irregularities, surveillance footage, witness statements, and most importantly, recorded conversations that paint a very clear picture of what really happened to that $50,000. She paused for effect, and none of it points to Deborah Washington. Deborah, still, sitting in the defendant's chair with her wrists cuffed, was crying openly now. But these weren't tears of despair anymore. They were tears of hope. Fragile, terrified hope. Davidson tried one last desperate play. Your Honor, this is clearly a stalling tactic. The defense is grasping at straws. The defense, Patricia said coldly, has bank records, security footage, and a pattern of behavior that would make any reasonable person question the integrity of this investigation. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that evidence doesn't matter when the defendant is black. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Carter's hand moved toward his gavel, but he stopped. For the first time in his 8 years on the bench, William Carter looked genuinely uncertain. Kevin reached into his backpack and pulled out his old laptop, a beat-up model he'd bought at a pawn shop, for $40. He held it up for the court to see. I have recordings, he said simply. Conversations. Lots of them. Thomas Mitchell made a small, strangled sound in the back of his throat, and Judge William Carter, for the first time in years, felt something he'd almost forgotten. Fear. Kevin walked calmly to the front of the courtroom, his laptop tucked under one arm. A bailiff moved to stop him, but Patricia raised a hand. Let the boy speak, Your Honor. Unless you'd prefer we present this evidence to the federal investigators directly. Carter's jaw clenched. After a long, tense moment, he waved his hand in resignation. Proceed. Kevin set the laptop on the defense table and opened it. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across his face. His fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising speed, the kind of familiarity that came from countless hours at the public library, teaching himself everything the schools couldn't or wouldn't. For the past 6 months, Kevin began, his voice steady and clear. I've been recording conversations in this courthouse. My mother brings me here sometimes after school because she can't afford childcare. Everyone thinks kids don't pay attention. They talk like we're not even in the room. He clicked on a file, and suddenly the courtroom speakers crackled to life. A voice unmistakably Prosecutor Davidson's echoed through the chamber. Blacks always steal when they get the chance. It's in their nature, followed immediately by Judge Carter's responding laugh. Exactly. That's why you don't even need to investigate much. We already know the outcome. The recording was crystal clear. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. Spectators gasped and murmured. Several people pulled out their phones, already texting or recording. Davidson shot to his feet. That was taken out of context. That was a private conversation. There is no context. Patricia cut him off, her voice like ice. That makes racism acceptable, especially not from a prosecutor who's supposed to pursue justice impartially. Carter banged his gavel repeatedly, his face now a deep crimson. This is outrageous. This is illegal surveillance. Actually, Patricia said calmly, According to state law, recording conversations in public buildings where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy is perfectly legal. The hallways, courtrooms, and common areas of this courthouse all qualify. Kevin clicked to another file. This one's from last week. Carter's voice filled the room again. That kid thinks he can come here and play lawyer. Janitor's son trying to be smart. I'll show him his place. More gasps. More camera flashes. Kevin didn't stop. He played recording after recording, each one more damning than the last. These black cases are always the same. Guilty until proven innocent. Saves the court time, especially single black women. They always make up excuses. Poor people lie like they breathe. You can't trust them. Every word, every laugh, every casual expression of bigotry was captured in perfect clarity, and with each recording, Kevin could see the realization spreading through the courtroom like poison. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a culture, a system. Deborah Washington sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking. Not from shame, but from vindication. From the overwhelming relief of finally being believed. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one, because what Kevin's about to reveal goes even deeper than anyone could have imagined. Patricia let the recordings speak for themselves for a solid 5 minutes. The cumulative effect was devastating. By the time Kevin closed the laptop, several people in the gallery were crying. Others looked physically ill. Davidson had gone silent, slumped in his chair like a man who'd just watched his career implode in real time. Judge Carter looked small, diminished. The authority and power he'd wielded so cruelly for years had evaporated, leaving behind just a bitter, angry man in a wheelchair. These recordings, Patricia said, addressing the room at large, have already been forwarded to the National Council of Magistrates, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and every major news outlet in the country. By tomorrow morning, this courthouse will be under federal investigation. She turned to face Carter directly. Your career is over, Judge. But that's not why we're here. She gestured to Deborah. We're here because an innocent woman is about to be convicted of a crime she didn't commit. And we're here to make sure that doesn't happen. Kevin stepped forward again. Mr. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Do you remember March 15th? It was a Friday, late night. You came back to the courthouse at 11:47 p.m. The parking lot security cameras caught you. Mitchell's face had gone completely gray. He looked like he might pass out. I pulled the footage, Kevin continued. It took me 3 weeks to figure out how to access the security system. Turns out, they use a pretty basic password setup, but I got in. And what I found was interesting. He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and held it up. On March 15th, Mr. Mitchell entered the building alone. He stayed for 42 minutes, and when he left, he was carrying a briefcase he didn't have when he went in. Patricia took the USB drive from Kevin and connected it to her own laptop. Within seconds, grainy security footage appeared on a portable projector she'd set up. The courtroom watched in complete silence as Thomas Mitchell, clearly visible despite the low-quality image, entered the courthouse late at night, walked purposefully through empty hallways, and emerged 3/4 of an hour later carrying a leather briefcase. The safe was open that night, Kevin said. The system logs show it. But the logs were altered the next day to make it look like my mother had opened it during her regular shift. He looked at Mitchell. You have administrative access to the security systems. You're one of only 3 people who can alter those logs. Mitchell's hands were shaking violently now. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Patricia pulled out yet another document. We also have bank records showing that Mr. Mitchell deposited $48,000 in cash into a personal account 3 days after the theft. He deposited it at 3 different banks in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. That's not. Mitchell finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. Not true. Patricia finished for him. We have the deposit slips. We have the bank surveillance footage. We have your signature. She spread the documents out on a table like a dealer showing a winning hand. We also have records of your gambling debts. Turns out you owe money to some very unpleasant people. $50,000 would be just enough to get them off your back, wouldn't it? Mitchell's face crumpled. In that moment, Kevin saw it happen, the complete collapse of a man's defenses. The moment when denial became impossible. Mitchell's now, voice broke. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just needed the debts. They were going to. He stopped, realizing he'd just confessed in a room full of witnesses. Patricia turned to Judge Carter. Your Honor, I believe we've clearly established that Deborah Washington is innocent, that Thomas Mitchell is the actual perpetrator of this theft. I formally move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. Carter sat frozen in his wheelchair, his mind clearly struggling to process the total annihilation of his case and his reputation. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again, and two federal agents in dark suits entered. Thomas Mitchell, one of them said, holding up a badge. FBI, we need you to come with us. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and tampering with evidence. Mitchell didn't resist. He stood up slowly, his legs barely supporting him, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. As the agents led him away, he glanced back at Kevin one last time. The boy's expression hadn't changed. He wasn't gloating or triumphant. He just looked tired, like someone who'd carried a tremendous weight for far too long. As Mitchell disappeared through the doors, Patricia addressed the court one final time. Judge Carter, in light of this evidence and the evidence of systematic racial bias displayed in those recordings, I'm also filing a formal complaint with the State Bar Association and requesting a full investigation into every case you've presided over in the past decade. She paused, letting that sink in. Every single case. Because how many other innocent people have been convicted in this courtroom based on the color of their skin rather than the facts of their cases? The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Carter's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests. His face had gone from crimson to pale, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. The stress, the humiliation, the complete destruction of everything he'd built, it was all crashing down on him at once. And then, something extraordinary happened. Judge William Carter felt it first as a tingling sensation in his toes, something he hadn't felt in 8 years. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a phantom sensation born of extreme stress, but then it spread, up through his feet, into his ankles, his calves. His breathing quickened. Not from panic this time, but from shock. Your Honor? Patricia noticed the change in his expression. Are you all right? Carter didn't respond. He was staring down at his legs with an expression of complete disbelief. His right foot twitched, then his left. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with conversation following Mitchell's arrest, fell silent as people noticed what was happening. Kevin watched intently, his expression unreadable. He'd studied psychosomatic paralysis during his months of research. He'd read about how extreme psychological trauma could cause physical paralysis even when there was no structural damage to the spine. And he'd read about the rare cases, very rare, where equally extreme psychological events could reverse it. He'd gambled everything on this possibility. Not because he was certain it would work, but because he understood something fundamental about Judge William Carter. The man's paralysis wasn't just physical, it was wrapped up in his identity, his bitterness, his need to feel superior, even while trapped in a wheelchair. Strip away that superiority, force him to confront the truth about himself, and the psychological dam might break. Carter's hands moved to his thighs. He pressed down, and his legs responded. The muscles contracted. His knees bent slightly. Oh my God, someone whispered. He's moving his legs, another voice said, louder now. The courtroom erupted into shocked murmurs and exclamations. Carter's face was a mask of confusion and terror. He looked up at Kevin, and for the first time, there was no contempt in his eyes, only fear, and something that might have been recognition. I said I would make you walk, Kevin said quietly, his voice barely audible over the walk. Commotion. But I never said it would be the way you expected. Doctors would later spend months arguing about what happened in that courtroom. Some would insist it was a case of psychosomatic paralysis reversed by extreme stress. Others would call it spontaneous neurological recovery triggered by adrenaline. A few would suggest it was simply coincidence that Carter had been on the verge of recovery anyway, and the timing was purely random. But everyone in that courtroom believed they'd witnessed something impossible. Carter gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and, with tremendous effort, pushed himself up. His legs shook violently, barely able to support his weight after 8 years of disuse. His face contorted with concentration and pain, but he stood. For the first time in nearly a decade, Judge William Carter stood on his own 2 feet. The courtroom exploded. People jumped up, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. It was pandemonium, but Carter wasn't celebrating. He stood there, trembling, and the expression on his face wasn't joy or relief. It was horror, because in that moment, he understood exactly what had happened. The paralysis that had defined him, that he'd used as both an excuse and a weapon, was gone. And with it went every shield he'd hidden behind. He'd gained the ability to walk, but he'd lost everything worth walking for. Patricia Williams moved quickly, sensing that the moment needed to be seized. Your Honor, or, should I say, Mr. Carter, I believe you have a decision to make. You can either dismiss all charges against Deborah Washington right now, or you can continue to preside over this case while under federal investigation for civil rights violations. Carter looked at her, then at Kevin, then at Deborah, who was still crying in the defendant's chair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow. Case dismissed. All charges dropped. He reached for his gavel with a shaking hand and brought it down once. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a death knell. This court is adjourned. Bailiffs rushed forward to help Carter back into his wheelchair. He couldn't stand for more than a few seconds, but he waved them away. He wanted to walk, even if it was just a few steps. He needed to feel it, needed to know it was real. He took 3 unsteady steps toward his chamber's door before his legs gave out. A bailiff caught him and eased him back into the wheelchair. But those 3 steps felt like 3 miles, as Carter was wheeled out of his own courtroom for the last time as a judge. Kevin walked over to his mother. A bailiff quickly removed Deborah's handcuffs. Mom, Kevin said simply. Deborah pulled her son into her arms and sobbed into his shoulder. You did it, baby. You did it. I don't know how, but you did it. Kevin hugged her back, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd carried. The fear, the pressure, the terrible responsibility of being 12 years old and knowing that his mother's freedom depended entirely on him. I told you I'd fix it, he whispered. Patricia Williams stood nearby, giving them their moment. When Deborah finally pulled back, wiping tears from her face, Patricia stepped forward. Mrs. Washington, we still have work to do. We need to file a civil suit against the court system for wrongful prosecution, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. You're entitled to significant compensation. Deborah shook her head, still dazed. I can't pay. You. I don't have. Pro bono, Patricia said with a smile. Completely free. In fact, when we win, and we will win, my fee comes out of the settlement. You won't pay a dime. She looked at Kevin. Besides, I think I owe your son a debt. He's reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. The courtroom was slowly emptying, but reporters lingered, trying to get statements. Patricia handled them with practiced ease, giving just enough information to ensure the story would dominate the news cycle, while protecting the Washingtons' privacy. Kevin noticed something as they walked out of the courthouse. People were looking at his mother differently now. Not with contempt or dismissal, but with respect, with recognition. She was no longer invisible. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt warm on Kevin's face. He'd spent so many months inside that building, watching and waiting, that he'd almost forgotten what natural light felt like. Kevin, Patricia said as they reached her car, I want to talk to you about something. You're 12 years old, but you just did what most lawyers couldn't do. You built a case, gathered evidence, and exposed corruption at the highest levels. She crouched down to his eye level. Have you ever thought about becoming a lawyer? Kevin considered the question. I thought about it. But lawyers have to work within the system. Sometimes the system is the problem. Patricia smiled. Smart kid. But the best lawyers know when to work within the system and when to burn it down and rebuild. That's what you just did. She handed him a card. When you're ready for college, call me. I'll make sure you get into the best law school in the country. Full scholarship. You have my word. Kevin took the card and slipped it into his pocket. Thank you, Miss Williams, for everything. Thank you, Kevin. You've done more for justice today than most people do in a lifetime. As Patricia drove away, Deborah and Kevin stood on the courthouse steps, looking up at the building that had nearly destroyed their lives. What now? Deborah asked. Kevin thought about the question. About Thomas Mitchell, probably being booked into a federal detention center right now. About Judge Carter, whose medical miracle would be remembered only as the punctuation mark on his disgrace. About Prosecutor Davidson, whose racist recordings would follow him for the rest of his career. Now, Kevin said, we go home. And tomorrow, you don't have to clean anyone's toilets anymore. Deborah laughed through fresh tears. Baby, I still need to work. Not there. Patricia said the settlement will take care of us. And when it comes through, you're going to find a job where people treat you like you matter. Because you do. They walked down the steps together, mother and son, and for the first time in months, Deborah felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope for the future. 6 months later, the courthouse where it all happened looked the same from the outside. Same marble steps, same imposing columns, same brass fixtures that gleamed in the sunlight. But everything that mattered had changed. Judge William Carter had resigned exactly 1 week after the trial. He'd had no choice. The recordings Kevin had, collected all 73 hours of them, had been reviewed by a federal task force. The evidence of systematic racial bias was so overwhelming that the Department of Justice launched an investigation not just into Carter, but into the entire judicial district. 14 cases were overturned, 11 wrongful convictions based on racial prejudice. 3 people were released from prison after serving time for crimes they didn't commit. Carter's ability to walk again became a twisted irony that followed him everywhere. News outlets ran the story with headlines like, Miracle Cure, Cursed, Life, and Judge Walks Again, but has nowhere to go. No law firm would touch him. His name had become synonymous with racism and corruption. He moved to a small town 3 states away where nobody knew his face. He took a job doing contract review for an insurance company, mindless work that paid barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment. His wife divorced him 2 months after the recordings went public, taking everything in the settlement. Now he walked alone through unfamiliar streets, passing people who didn't recognize him, and every single step reminded him that he'd traded his paralysis for something worse, complete and utter irrelevance. Thomas Mitchell fared worse. The federal prosecution moved swiftly. The evidence was so overwhelming that his own lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, and tampering with evidence. But the FBI investigation didn't stop with the courthouse theft. They dug deeper and discovered that Mitchell had been stealing for nearly 3 years, small amounts at first, a few thousand here and there from discretionary funds that no one really monitored. But his gambling addiction had grown faster than his thefts, and by the end, he was desperate. The total amount stolen was over $200,000. His wife filed for divorce before he was even sentenced. His 2 teenage children refused to visit him in prison. The BMW was repossessed. The house auctioned off to pay restitution. Everything he'd stolen, everything he'd bought with blood money, was stripped away. In prison, Mitchell learned that being known as the man who stole and framed an innocent black woman for a crime she didn't commit didn't win you many friends. Other inmates had seen the news coverage. They'd heard the recordings. They knew what kind of person he was. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from the general population, counting down 8 years in a 6x8 cell. Prosecutor Richard Davidson avoided prison, but his career was effectively over. The State Bar Association suspended his license pending investigation. News outlets played his racist comments on loop for weeks. His face became a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. The district attorney's office fired him 3 days after the recordings went public, citing conduct unbecoming of a prosecutor and violation of ethical standards. He tried to find work at private firms, but his reputation preceded him. No one wanted to hire the racist prosecutor from the viral recordings. He ended up moving to a different state and taking a job selling insurance. It paid $35,000 a year, less than half what he'd made as a prosecutor. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment and avoided making eye contact with black customers, afraid they'd recognize him. Sometimes late at night, he'd lie awake and replay that moment in his mind, when the 12-year-old boy pressed play on those recordings and destroyed his entire life. He'd spent years building his career, and it took Kevin Washington less than an hour to tear it all down. The anger he felt about it would fade eventually, replaced by something worse, the creeping recognition that Kevin had been right, that everything he'd lost, he'd deserved to lose. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in Kevin's story so far, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because what happened next changed not just one courthouse, but an entire system. For Kevin and Deborah Washington, life changed in ways they'd never imagined. The civil suit Patricia Williams filed on their behalf settled for $2.7 million. The court system, desperate to avoid a protracted trial that would expose even more corruption, agreed to pay. Deborah Washington never cleaned another toilet. Instead, she was promoted after significant pressure from the federal investigation to administrative supervisor of the new court that replaced Carter's. The position came with a salary of $68,000 a year and full benefits. More importantly, it came with respect. The woman who'd once been invisible now walked the halls of that courthouse with her head held high. Judges greeted her by name. Lawyers asked for her input on administrative matters. The janitors she supervised knew that she understood their work because she'd done it herself for 15 years. She used part of the settlement money to buy a house, a real house with a yard and 3 bedrooms in a good neighborhood with good schools. Kevin finally had his own room, with a desk for studying and shelves for his growing collection of books on law, justice, and civil rights. Deborah framed the first paycheck from her new job and hung it in the kitchen, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented: dignity. Patricia Williams became more than just their lawyer. She became Kevin's mentor. Once a month, she'd drive up from New York to have dinner with the Washington family. She'd bring law books, court case transcripts, articles about civil rights history. She and Kevin would sit in the living room for hours, discussing legal strategy, constitutional law, precedent, and procedure. "You have something rare," Patricia told him once. "You have the ability to see systems how they work, where they're broken, who they serve, and who they hurt. Most lawyers spend years in law school trying to develop that vision. You already have it." Kevin was enrolled in one of the best private schools in the state on a full academic scholarship. The story of what he'd done had spread, and selective schools were competing to have him. He chose the one with the strongest debate team and the best civics program. At school, he was different from the other students. While they stressed over standardized tests and college applications, Kevin had already testified before a congressional subcommittee on judicial reform. While they worried about social hierarchies and popularity, Kevin had been interviewed on national news programs. Some of his classmates treated him like a celebrity. Others resented him, calling him arrogant or opportunistic. Kevin didn't care much either way. He'd learned that the opinions of people who'd never fought for anything real didn't carry much weight, but he did make friends, real ones. Students from other scholarship programs, kids who'd grown up poor or in foster care or undocumented. Kids who understood that the world wasn't fair and that surviving it required both intelligence and determination. Together, they started a club called Youth Justice Initiative. They researched local cases of potential wrongful conviction. They documented instances of police misconduct. They filed public records requests and freedom of information demands. They were 12, 13, 14 years old, and they were becoming a problem for every lazy, corrupt, or biased official in the city. Kevin also started a YouTube channel called True Justice. At first, it was just him sitting in his bedroom, talking to a laptop camera about the legal system, how it worked, how it failed, how young people could fight back when it failed them. He taught viewers about their rights during police encounters. He explained how to document evidence of discrimination. He broke down complex legal concepts into terms a middle schooler could understand. The channel grew slowly at first, then exponentially. Within 6 months, he had over 200,000 subscribers. Within a year, nearly $1 million. His most popular video was titled, How I proved my mother's innocence and made a judge walk again. In it, he walked through the entire strategy, how he'd gathered evidence, how he'd identified the real thief, how he'd documented the racism that had nearly destroyed his family. But he ended the video with a message that resonated with viewers around the world. Don't wait until you grow up to fight for what's right. Injustice has no age limit, so neither should the fight against it. You have power right now, today, exactly as you are. You just have to be brave enough to use it. The comment section was flooded with thousands of messages from young people, some facing their own injustices, others simply inspired by Kevin's story. One comment in particular stuck with him. It was from a 14-year-old girl in Chicago. My uncle is in prison for something he didn't do. Everyone says there's nothing we can do because we're just kids and we don't have money for a lawyer. But you showed me that's not true. I'm going to fight for him. Thank you for showing me how. Kevin responded, document everything. Record everything you legally can. Build your case one piece of evidence at a time. And if you need help, message me. We don't abandon each other. He meant it. Over the next year, Kevin and the Youth Justice Initiative helped that girl expose police misconduct that had led to her uncle's wrongful conviction. The case was overturned. Stories like that became more common. Kevin's platform grew into something bigger than him. It became a network of young people who refused to accept injustice just because adults told them it was normal. 1 year after the trial, Kevin was invited to appear on the nation's largest news program, a prime-time special called Voices of Change, that featured people who'd made significant impacts on society. He was the youngest person ever invited to appear. The interview took place in a studio in Manhattan. Deborah flew out with him, and Patricia came to the taping to provide support. Kevin wore a suit that actually fit him this time. Patricia had insisted on buying him a proper one. The host, Amanda Richardson, was a veteran journalist known for her tough but fair interview style. She'd covered presidential elections, international conflicts, and corporate scandals. Interviewing a 13-year-old boy about justice reform was new territory, but she approached it with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. The cameras went live, and after a brief introduction, Amanda turned to Kevin. Kevin Washington, thank you for being here. A year ago, you walked into a Mazza courtroom and accomplished something that most lawyers couldn't. You proved your mother's innocence, exposed systematic corruption, and somehow fulfilled an impossible promise to make a paralyzed judge walk again. Let's start with the most basic question. How did you know you could do it? Kevin thought for a moment before answering. I didn't know I could do it, he said honestly. But I knew I had to try. My mother taught me that when you see injustice, you have two choices: accept it or fight it. Accepting it was never an option. Amanda leaned forward. But you were 12 years old. Taking on a judge, a prosecutor, an entire court system. Most adults wouldn't have that courage. Where did yours come from? Kevin's expression grew more serious. It didn't feel like courage at the time. It felt like survival. When the system decides you're guilty because of how you abound, look, or where you come from, you don't have the luxury of waiting for adults to fix it. You either fight or you accept that you're going to be crushed. He paused. And I'd seen my mother be crushed enough. It was my turn to stand up. Amanda pulled up images from the trial on the screen behind them, photos of Kevin standing in the courtroom, of the judge's shocked expression, of Deborah crying in the defendant's chair. Walk us through your strategy, Amanda said. How does a 12-year-old build a case strong enough to overturn a judge's decision? Kevin explained methodically. The months of observation, the recordings, identifying Thomas Mitchell's suspicious behavior and investigating his finances, reaching out to Patricia Williams, building the evidence piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. But here's what I want people to understand, Kevin added. I'm not special. I'm not some genius or superhero. I just paid attention. I listened when people thought I wasn't listening. I watched when people thought I was invisible, and I believed that truth matters more than power. Amanda nodded. Let's talk about the recordings. You documented over 70 hours of racist conversations among court officials. What was that like? Listening to people talk about you and your mother that way? Kevin's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of emotion. It hurt. Every time. But I learned to separate my feelings from my goal. I wasn't recording those conversations to validate what I already knew, that some people are racist. I was recording them because I knew that one day I'd need evidence. And feelings aren't evidence. Their own words were, "Did you ever doubt yourself?" Amanda asked. "Ever think about giving up?" "Every single day," Kevin admitted. "There were nights when I'd lie awake thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I can't prove it? What if they convict my mom anyway, and it's my fault for giving her false hope?" He looked directly at the camera. "But then I'd remember something my mom told me when I was little. She said, 'Baby, the world is going to try to make you feel small. It's going to try to convince you that you don't matter. Your job is to prove them wrong, not with anger, but with excellence.' So that's what I did. I made myself excellent at gathering evidence, at documenting injustice, at building a case that even the most biased judge couldn't ignore." Amanda shifted topics. "Let's talk about Judge Carter. You promised him something impossible, that you'd make him walk again. And against all medical odds, he did walk. Do you believe that was a miracle?" Kevin shook his head. "No. I believe it was psychology. Judge Carter's paralysis wasn't purely physical, it was psychosomatic. His body had trapped his trauma, his bitterness, his need to feel powerful even though he felt helpless. When I exposed the truth about him, when I stripped away all his defenses, something broke in him. And that break released what his body had been holding on to." He paused. "But here's the thing people don't understand. I didn't do it to heal him. I did it to prove a point. He'd spent years looking down on people from his wheelchair, using his disability as a shield for his cruelty. Making him walk again meant he couldn't hide behind that anymore. He had to stand up and face what he'd become." The camera caught Amanda's expression, a mixture of surprise and respect. Most people had assumed Kevin's promise was either youthful naivete or divine intervention. Kevin was explaining it as calculated psychological warfare against a corrupt judge. "That's remarkably sophisticated thinking for someone your age," Amanda said. "Age doesn't determine how much you've suffered," Kevin replied quietly. "And suffering teaches you things that comfort never can." The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Amanda asked about the YouTube channel, about the Youth Justice Initiative, about Kevin's plans for the future. "I want to be a civil rights lawyer," Kevin said when asked about his dreams. "Like Miss Williams. Someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. But not just that," he added. "I want to change the system from the inside. I want to train the next generation of prosecutors and judges to understand that justice isn't about winning cases. It's about finding truth, real truth, not convenient truth." Near the end of the interview, Amanda asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Kevin, a lot of people look at your story and see inspiration. But some critics have said that the burden of fixing a broken justice system shouldn't fall on children, that you shouldn't have had to fight this battle at 2 years old. What do you say to that?" Kevin's response was immediate and firm. "They're right. I shouldn't have had to do this. No child should. But the system failed me and my mother long before I walked into that courtroom. So I had two choices. Let it keep failing us, or fix it myself." He leaned forward. "And here's what I want those critics to understand. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for praise. I'm asking for change. Because right now, there are thousands of kids like me all over this country who are watching their parents be crushed by a system that doesn't care about truth or justice. It cares about conviction rates and maintaining power. Those kids need to know they're not powerless. They need to know that injustice can be fought. That evidence matters. That truth matters. That they matter." The camera held on his face for a long moment. At 13, Kevin Washington had the eyes of someone much older. Someone who'd seen the worst of humanity and chosen to fight it anyway. When the interview aired, it broke viewership records. The YouTube video of the full interview was watched 30 million times in the first week. Comments flooded in from around the world. "This kid gives me hope for the future. We need more people like Kevin Washington in the justice system. Imagine what he'll accomplish when he's actually old enough to be a lawyer." But the comment that meant the most to Kevin came from someone unexpected. It was posted anonymously, but the IP address traced back to the federal prison where Thomas Mitchell was serving his sentence. "I stole because I was weak. You fought because you were strong. I hope one day I can be half the man you already are at 13. I'm sorry for what I did to your family. Kevin never responded to it publicly. But late that night, he pulled up the comment again and stared at it for a long time. Justice, he was learning, wasn't just about punishment. It was also about accountability, about people facing the truth of what they'd done and choosing even from a prison cell to be better. That, Kevin thought, might be the most important lesson of all. 2 years after the trial, Kevin Washington stood in front of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. At 14, he was testifying as an expert witness on judicial reform and the impact of racial bias in the criminal justice system. The room was packed with senators, journalists, legal scholars, and advocates. Senator Margaret Hayes, who chaired the committee, introduced him with obvious respect in her voice. Mr. Washington, thank you for being here. Your experience has sparked a national conversation about systemic racism in our courts. We're hoping your testimony today will help us craft legislation that prevents what happened to your mother from happening to anyone else. Kevin adjusted the microphone in front of him. He'd prepared for this moment for weeks, working with Patricia Williams to structure his testimony in a way that would be both powerful and actionable. Thank you, Senator. 2 years ago, I watched the justice system try to destroy my mother because she was black, poor, and convenient. I watched a judge make jokes about her guilt before reviewing any evidence. I watched a prosecutor build a case not on facts, but on stereotypes, and I realized something that changed my life. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's just not designed for people who look like me and my mother. He paused, letting the words settle. The question isn't whether individual judges or prosecutors are racist. Some are, some aren't. The question is whether the system itself creates conditions where racism can flourish without consequence. And the answer is yes. For the next hour, Kevin laid out a detailed plan for reform. Mandatory body cameras and audio recording in all courtrooms, independent oversight committees to review cases involving racial minorities, stricter penalties for prosecutors and judges found to have engaged in racial bias, required implicit bias training that actually worked, not the superficial seminars most courts currently used. But his most controversial recommendation was about accountability. Right now, Kevin explained, judges have something called qualified immunity. It means they can't be sued personally for their decisions, even if those decisions are based on racism or living corruption. That needs to end. If a judge destroys someone's life because of bias, they should face consequences beyond just losing their job. They should face civil liability, financial consequences, criminal prosecution when appropriate. Senator James Mitchell, no relation to Thomas Mitchell, pushed back. Mr. Washington, don't you think that would make judges too hesitant to make difficult decisions? That they'd be afraid of being sued? Kevin looked directly at him. Senator, with all due respect, if a judge is afraid of being sued for making racist decisions, then maybe fear is exactly what we need. Good judges who base their rulings on evidence and law have nothing to fear from accountability. Only bad judges do. The room erupted in applause from the gallery. Senator Hayes had to bang her gavel to restore order. Kevin's testimony was covered extensively. Clips went viral. Legal scholars debated his proposals on news programs. Some called him naive. Others called him visionary. But regardless of opinion, no one could ignore him. The Youth Justice Initiative that Kevin had founded with his friends had grown into a national organization. They had chapters in 32 states, with over 10,000 young members actively working on criminal justice reform projects. They'd helped overturn 17 wrongful convictions. They'd documented hundreds of instances of police misconduct. They'd filed lawsuits against school districts with discriminatory discipline policies. They'd lobbied state legislatures to raise the age of criminal responsibility, arguing that children, especially children of color, deserved rehabilitation, not prison. And they'd created a database of judges and prosecutors with documented histories of racial bias, making that information publicly accessible, so lawyers could file recusal motions when their clients were minorities. The database was controversial. Legal organizations accused Kevin of targeting officials and creating lists that could endanger careers. Kevin's response was blunt. If your career can be ended by making your own words and actions public, then maybe you shouldn't have said or done those things. Transparency isn't an attack, it's accountability. The database stayed online. Meanwhile, Deborah Washington had become something of a symbol herself. She was invited to speak at conferences about criminal justice reform, workplace discrimination, and the experiences of Black women in America. At first, she'd been terrified of public speaking, but Kevin had encouraged her. "Mom, you lived through something that most people can't imagine. Your story matters. And there are women out there right now who are going through what you went through. They need to hear from someone who survived it." So Deborah started speaking, and she discovered that she was good at it. She talked about the dignity of labor, about being treated as invisible, about the terror of watching the system target her son for having the audacity to fight back. She talked about the guilt she felt even though she'd done nothing wrong, simply because society had conditioned her to believe that people like her were always guilty of something. Her speeches were raw, emotional, and brutally honest. They went viral on social media. She appeared on podcasts, morning shows, and documentary films. And everywhere she went, she ended with the same message: "My son saved me. But he shouldn't have had to. No child should have to save their parent from a justice system that's supposed to protect us all." That's what we're fighting to change. Patricia Williams, true to her word, had secured Kevin a guaranteed spot at Columbia Law School with a full scholarship, to be claimed whenever he was ready. But she'd also introduced him to other paths. He spent a summer interning at the ACLU, another summer working with the Innocence Project. He attended symposiums on constitutional law, police reform, and restorative justice. By 15, Kevin Washington had more practical experience with the justice system than many practicing lawyers, but he remained grounded. He still lived in the same house with his mother. He still did homework and household chores. He still hung out with friends and played basketball on weekends, because beneath the activism and the public persona, he was still a teenager, trying to figure out who he was and who he wanted to become. One evening, sitting on their porch as the sun set, Deborah asked him a question that had been weighing on her. "Baby, do you ever regret it? Fighting the way you did? You gave up a normal childhood. You carry this responsibility now. Sometimes I wonder if I should have protected you from all of this." Kevin thought about it for a long time before answering. "I don't regret it, Mom. But I do wish things were different. I wish I didn't have to fight. I wish the system worked the way it's supposed to. I wish justice was actually blind." He looked at her. "But wishing doesn't change anything. Action does. And if my childhood was the price for your freedom and for helping other families avoid what we went through, then it was worth it." Deborah wiped tears from her eyes. "You're so much stronger than I ever was." "No," Kevin said firmly. "I learned my strength from you. You worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. You never gave up even when everything was against you. You taught me that dignity isn't something people give you, it's something you claim for yourself." They sat in comfortable silence, watching neighbors walk by, kids playing in yards, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood, at peace. It was the kind of peace Kevin had fought for, not just for himself, but for everyone. 3 years after the trial that changed everything, Kevin Washington, now 15 years old, stood at a podium in the same courthouse where his mother had nearly been convicted. But this wasn't a trial. It was a dedication ceremony. The building had undergone massive renovations following the federal investigation. New oversight systems were in place. Every courtroom now had audio and video recording. An independent civil rights commission reviewed cases monthly for evidence of bias. The hiring process for judges and prosecutors included extensive vetting for discriminatory behavior, and today, they were dedicating a bronze plaque in the main lobby. It read, "In memory of all those wrongly convicted by systems that valued prejudice over truth. May we never forget that justice requires both courage and vigilance." Dedicated in honor of Deborah and Kevin Washington, who reminded us that truth has no age, no color, and no surrender. Kevin stared at the plaque for a long time before his speech, thinking about how strange it was to be honored for something he'd simply done, out of necessity. Judge Martha Rodriguez, the woman who'd replaced Carter and was now known for her fairness and commitment to reform, introduced him. 3 years ago, A 12-year-old boy walked into this courthouse and changed everything. Not with violence, not with anger, but with evidence, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in justice. Kevin Washington showed us that the fight for what's right doesn't require a law degree or decades of experience. It requires courage and integrity, things that, as he proved, even a child can possess. Kevin approached the podium to thunderous applause. The room was packed, former clients of Patricia Williams, members of the Youth Justice Initiative, journalists who'd covered his story, and dozens of people whose cases had been overturned following the investigation his work had triggered. Deborah sat in the front row, wearing a dress she'd bought for the occasion. She worked now as Director of Community Outreach for the reformed court system, helping bridge the gap between the justice system and the communities it served. She earned a good salary, had excellent benefits, and most importantly, worked with dignity and respect. Kevin began his speech. 3 years ago, I stood in this building and made an impossible promise. I told a judge that if he released my mother, I would make him walk again. Everyone laughed. They thought I was a desperate kid making wild claims. He paused. But here's what they didn't understand. The promise wasn't really about making someone walk. It was about making people face the truth about themselves, about forcing a system built on prejudice to look in the mirror and see what it had become. Judge Carter walked again that day. But he lost everything that mattered. Not because I took it from him, but because he'd already destroyed it himself with years of cruelty and bias. I didn't ruin his life. I just revealed what his life had become. Kevin looked around the room. And that's what truth does. It reveals. It exposes. It forces us to confront realities we'd rather ignore. Thomas Mitchell is in prison right now, not because a 12-year-old boy was smarter than him, but because he made the choice to steal and frame an innocent woman. Prosecutor Davidson lost his career not because I recorded him, but because he spent years saying things that no prosecutor should ever say. I didn't destroy these men. They destroyed themselves. I just made sure everyone else could see it. He shifted his tone, becoming more earnest. But this plaque, this ceremony, this reform, none of it matters if we stop here. Because right now, in courthouses across this country, there are people being convicted not because of evidence, but because of the color of their skin, because of where they live, because of how much money they have. There are kids watching their parents be taken away by a system that doesn't care about truth. There are families being torn apart because someone decided they looked guilty. Kevin's voice grew stronger. And those families need to know what I learned 3 years ago. You are not powerless. The system wants you to believe you are. It wants you to accept injustice as inevitable. But it's not. Justice is possible. Accountability is possible. Change is possible. It just requires people brave enough to fight for it. He looked directly at the young people in the audience, members of the Youth Justice Initiative who'd traveled from across the country to be here. Some of you are going through what my family went through. Some of you are watching injustice happen and wondering if there's anything you can do. I'm here to tell you. There is. Document everything. Record everything you legally can. Build your case one piece of evidence at a time. Find your Patricia Williams, someone who believes in you and will fight alongside you. And most importantly, never let anyone convince you that age or background disqualifies you from pursuing truth. My mother taught me that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. Justice works the same way. The applause was deafening. After the ceremony, Kevin spent hours talking with young people who wanted advice, families seeking help with their cases, lawyers interested in partnering with the Youth Justice Initiative. One conversation stayed with him. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, approached him shyly. She was Latina, with her hair in braids and wearing a dress that looked like it might be her Sunday best. "Mr. Washington," she said quietly, "my dad is in jail for something he didn't do. The lawyer says there's nothing we can do. But I've been watching your videos, and I think I found evidence that the police lied in their report." Kevin knelt down to her eye level. "What's your name?" "Maria." "Maria, tell me everything, and bring me whatever evidence you have. If your dad is innocent, we're going to prove it. Together." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of hope, not despair. "Really? You'll help?" "That's what we do," Kevin said. "We don't abandon each other." Later that evening, after everyone had left, Kevin and Deborah stood alone in the courthouse lobby, looking at the plaque. "You did it, baby," Deborah said softly. "You changed the world." Kevin shook his head. "I changed one courthouse. There are thousands more." "This is just the beginning," Deborah smiled. "Then I guess we'd better keep fighting." "Yeah," Kevin agreed. "We'd better." They walked out of the courthouse together, mother and son, into a warm evening where the future felt uncertain, but no longer hopeless, because they'd proven something that couldn't be unproven. That truth, when armed with courage and evidence, could defeat even the most entrenched injustice. That night, Kevin updated his YouTube channel, True Justice, with a new video. The title was simple. Later, What I've Learned About Justice. In it, he talked about the dedication ceremony, about the families he'd helped, about the work that still needed to be done. He ended the video with a message that had become his signature. Remember, injustice has no age limit, so neither should the USTA. Fight against it. Whatever you're facing, wherever you are, you have power. You just have to be brave enough to use it. Document, organize, fight, and never, ever, accept that wrong is right just because people in power say it is. Thank you for being part of this journey. Subscribe to True Justice if you haven't already. Share this video if it resonated with you. And most importantly, share your story in the comments, because every story of injustice is also a potential story of justice. It just needs someone brave enough to fight for it. The video was watched 5 million times in the first 24 hours. The comments section filled with thousands of messages. "I'm 14 and my brother is facing charges for something he didn't do. Kevin's videos taught me how to gather evidence. We got him released yesterday. Thank you. I'm a lawyer and Kevin has taught me more about this justice than law school ever did. This kid is going to be president one day. Mark my words." But the comment that made Kevin smile came from an unexpected source, an anonymous account that he suspected belonged to Judge Carter. "I walked again because of you, but I lost my soul. I hope one day I can find it. And when I do, I hope I can use whatever time I have left to undo some of the damage I caused. You were right about everything. Thank you for not letting me hide from the truth." Kevin never responded publicly, but he saved the comment, because that, ultimately, was what justice meant to him. Not just punishment, but transformation. Not just accountability, but the possibility of redemption. 5 years from now, Kevin Washington would enter Columbia Law School as the youngest student in the program's history. 10 years from now, he'd argue his first case before the Supreme Court, a landmark decision on qualified immunity that would reshape American jurisprudence. 20 years from now, he'd be nominated for a federal judgeship, becoming one of the youngest federal judges in history. But all of that was still to come. Tonight, at 15, Kevin Washington was just a kid who'd fought for his mother and, in doing so, had reminded America that justice was not the exclusive domain of the powerful. It belonged to anyone brave enough to demand it. So that's Kevin's story. A 12-year-old boy who made the impossible happen, not through magic, but through courage, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in truth. If this story moved you, if Kevin's journey reminded you that age doesn't determine power and that justice belongs to those brave enough to fight for it, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button for True Justice. Give this video a like so more people can hear this story. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what part of Kevin's fight resonated most with you. Tell me if you've ever faced injustice and how you fought back, or if you're facing it now and need encouragement to keep going. Because here's the truth. There are thousands of Kevins out there right now. Thousands of families facing corrupt systems. Thousands of young people who think they're powerless when they're anything but. This channel, True Justice, exists to remind you that dignity is claimed, not given. That evidence defeats prejudice. That truth, no matter how inconvenient, always deserves to be heard. So, subscribe. Share this story. And if you're fighting your own battle right now, document everything. Find your advocates. And never stop believing that justice is possible. Because if a 12-year-old boy could take down a corrupt judge, expose a thief, and reform an entire courthouse, then imagine what you can do when you decide that enough is enough. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of this community that believes justice isn't just a word, it's a fight worth having. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, keep fighting, keep believing, and never let anyone tell you that you're too young, too poor, or too powerless to change the world, because Kevin Washington proved them all wrong. And so can you.